Welcome to Syntax. On this Monday Hasty Treat, we're going to be talking about local data. Locally, right now, Wes, I'm trying to get a snack in. I don't know if you've ever had these rice mochi balls from Trader Joe's, but holy cow, they're my favorite thing in the whole world. It takes great restraint for me not to eat them all.
Eat that's the whole bag, yeah.
Yeah, I don't keep them locally in my office usually because then I'll need to access them all the time. But if you need to access your data locally, we're going to be talking about that in this episode. But what happens if you need to access your data locally and that data's not there and you're not checking to see if it's there correctly? Well, you're going to get a bug in your site. And oftentimes, with this stuff, especially if we're talking about syncing engines, making sure the data is where it's supposed to be, we can often get in these situations where we think we're in the happy path all the time, and oftentimes we might not even realize what that happy path is. I experience that all the time on my Habit Path app because I use local data and data syncing. And man, it is hard to solve those bugs, but not with Sentry, because Sentry lets me know who has what issues at any given point in my application, and I know what's happening beyond the happy path. It works for me. All my data is local. It works.
Nothing but sad paths in your Sentry. Just a sad place to be. But
you know what? The best part is too, Courtney also uses Habit Path, and just like most things, when other people use your stuff, it's really nice for them to be like, this is broken. And then I'll go check the Sentry, see what's going on, fix the problems. Head on over to sentry.io/syntax. Sign up, get 2 months for free with the coupon code TastyTreat. Sentry saves my bacon all the time. Wes, what's up, my man? How's it going?
Hey, let's talk about storing data locally. There's lots of ways you can store data in the browser, but let's talk about why you might want to store data in the browser first, right? Probably the first one is user preferences and user settings. You don't necessarily always have an account for somebody to store that in, or it doesn't make sense to always send that data back to the database every single time that it changes, right? So one example I'll have is on my course platform, as people are watching the videos, every time that the video current time updates, which can be every 2 to 3 seconds, I'm putting that data in local storage. And same with playback rate, volume level, like all those settings, right? I'll stick that in local storage, and then periodically they'll get synced to the back end. But it's nice to stick that in local storage or in the browser when you need it immediately.
Yeah, another thing too, often that I think you see this a lot more in native apps, which is something that people might be doing on the web more and more these days, is letting you use the thing before signing up for an account or even maybe paying for data syncing. That's like a thing where people pay to sync the data, and they say, actually, I need to have this available on all my devices. You can store that data. You can let the people use the application even before signing up for an account or even choosing to sync it to a server somewhere. And that's just like straight up usage of your application. If it is like a to-do app, you're physically saving all the mutations and doing everything in the local data. And in that same regard, you might be saving that data locally from the server into local storage or into your IndexedDB or LocalStorage or literally anything. So that way, you can access it faster, because if the data is already on the client, you don't need to go to the server to get it. So it's a way of accessing faster data as well.
Sometimes it can even just be a privacy thing.
Yes.
So I built a background removal tool, and the thing with people's photos is they don't want to upload them to some random sketchy service that they're going to have, right? So this background removal tool will just do it entirely in the browser, and the thing about that is if you refresh the page, they're gone. So you can stick those files and stick all the data related to that in the browser in one of the places we're going to be talking about. And that way, when you come back and refresh the page or even like I was on JS Bench the other day writing some benchmark tests for JavaScript, and I refreshed the page before I had saved it, or TypeScript Playground is another good example. Before I've saved it, right? Before it's in their database, if they even save that in their database, then it's gone. So it's nice to just persist it locally in the browser before you even have decided to send that to a server.
Yeah, I think anytime, like you said, anytime that you would expect your application to if you hit the refresh button, for it to remain in the same state as when you left off. You're filling out a form. You're shopping at a store, you have a draft of a tweet, those types of things, right? Anytime you want that state to persist is a perfect opportunity to save your users some headaches by putting that information in local data. Let me tell you, there is nothing more frustrating than filling out a big-ass form and having the page refresh for some reason and having to start over. If you are doing job application things where they ask you to fill out every single one of your experiences or any of that stuff, you gotta have that data storing locally or something so that way the user isn't losing that. That drives me absolutely crazy as a user.
Too.
Yeah. And your users will be delighted for it. I'll tell you that. Another one is auth tokens. We don't often think about this, but anytime you log into anything, it's either storing it in a cookie or local storage, typically, whether it's a session token or a JWT as an access token, those types of things. These are stored locally on your client. Reason being is anytime you have a request to that server, you need that information there at the initial request. That way the server can be able to authenticate it as you go or authorize it. Man, I don't know about you, but I flip-flop authorization and authentication so much. I'm talking with the ZeroSync folks all the time, and I'll use the word authentication, and they'll be like, you mean authorization, right? I'm like, yes, I do. Gosh, darn it, again. It flip-flops in my brain for some reason.
I don't know that I would use the word authorization. Authentication is where I'm at. Authorization is like a credit card thing to me.
No. They are very distinct in web development or even any sort of login system, right? And I'm going to mess this up. Authentication is logging in, right? It's the process of logging in, and authorization is the process of making sure you have access to the things you have access to.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I always just goof it up, though, when I'm trying to say it quickly. Let's talk about where you can store your data.
All right. So first one is cookies. Storing data in your user's browser, you can throw them in cookies. There are HTTP cookies, which can only be set and read via the server and server requests. And then there are just regular cookies, which can be set and read via JavaScript as well. Cookies have a limit to how much data you can stick in them. So generally, cookies are only used for things like language settings, session IDs, just like identifiers and short little text settings for that specific user.
Yes. Next up is local storage. Local storage is often more used for single values like a JWT, which could then be encoded, decoded, those types of things, or a simple string value. Or you might use a local storage for preferences, anything that you need to just save. Again, typically just a single string, save it, retrieve it, those types of deals.
Yeah, local storage you can fit a lot in there, but the thing about local storage is that it's only text, right? It's key value store. So if you are trying to store something that is not text, you have to convert that to text. So if it's an object, you JSON stringify it. If it's an image, you can store images in local storage by converting to base 64. It's probably not the best bet, but it's a really simple API where you can simply just say localstorage.set item, localstorage.get item. You can pull it out. The only thing that gets me sometimes is I'll pull something out of local storage and assume it's an object and assume you can JSON parse it, but it's not always the case, right? Sometimes you accidentally set undefined and then try to JSON parse undefined and you're in trouble.
I'm almost always saving things in cookies over local storage for no particular reason other than I just do. But nowadays, if I'm storing data like beyond single values or whatever, I'm using IndexedDB typically. There's also session storage. So session storage, just like local storage. However, if you close the browser, you close the tab, that's the end of the session and it goes away. I've never used session storage. I'm going to be straight up about that. I just haven't hit a situation where I needed session storage, but I'm sure there's plenty of reasons to use it.
I think a good example of session storage would be, you were just talking about like you're filling out a form or a job application. You want to be able to refresh the page and that data to persist. Session storage will persist in the same tab if you refresh the page. It'll not if you open up a secondary tab. And that's really important if somebody is potentially on a shared computer. So you imagine a job application. Somebody goes to apply for a job. They fill out the thing. Maybe they don't finish it, and then they close the tab. If you put that in local storage, somebody else comes around and opens up the same website, then there's a bit of a privacy issue because now you're sharing your data between users of the same device. Whereas session storage would, as long as they close the tab, you'll be fine. It's cleaned up.
Yeah, that makes way too much sense. So thank you for that. Next up is IndexedDB, which like a lot of people, I think, they say that it's hard to work with. And honestly, I've used it just, raw, straight up API, and I didn't find it to be that awful. It's not like the most fun API. It's not as simple as just get set whatever. However, I do use Dexie quite a bit. Dexie is a small library on top of IndexedDB, and it's basically just giving you a nice little API for creating, getting, updating data, and you have to do a little bit of setup, but it's more like working with things that you're typical, like normal databases that you work with. And for the most part, I found Dexie to be nice to work in. And pretty much anytime I need to store structured data, an object of data, I'm not picking cookies or local storage. I'm picking IndexedDB, obviously, because that's what it's made for.
You can't query local storage, right? You can simply just check if a key is there or not, whereas IndexedDB is a database, and you can query it and filter and do all the stuff you're used to. And I picked up Dexie.js for that background removal project I did, both to store files, which the browser also has file storage. We did a whole episode on that, but you can also just store like blobs of data in IndexedDB.
Yeah.
And the cool thing about it is it has like React hooks and Svelte hooks, so that as long as you save it to IndexedDB, your application is reactive, and it's your whole state store, and it's a really cool project. I'm a big fan of it.
I want to introduce you to a library from Kyle Simpson of You Don't Know JavaScript fame. Yeah. He has a library. He has like a kind of a bunch of new packages called BYOJS that are all kind of cool. And one of these is a storage package called Storage, byojs.dev/storage. And the stated goal of this project is to have a simple key value storage API for all of the storage mechanisms. So you have a basic get and set, and the only difference is where you import those from. So you import it from IDB for IndexedDB, from local storage or session storage cookie, OPFS, which is the private file system. And so, basically it just gives you the same API to work with and all of this stuff. And I thought this was a really neat API that you don't really hear a lot of people talking about.
That's cool. It seems like it's only key value though, right? So
it's
you wouldn't be able
to
query. You know what I really like about some key value stores? Dino's key value does this, is you can set an array of keys. So you could say like user and user 123. And that way you'd be able to query all the users, or just query user 123.
Yeah,
I'm sure more key value databases are like that.
Sure.
But that's Dino's key value store is one. It's built on top of SQLite.
Oh, there's also a host of really wild new options that people are exploring in this area right now, as we start to get like more down this rabbit hole of using local data more frequently in applications. People are wondering, what can we do that is beyond IndexedDB? So a couple of these things are using WASM. So one of them is SQLite via WASM is increasingly more of an interesting option. Although, who was it? I believe there is like a penalty, essentially like an initial download penalty, where the first time you load it up, there is a pretty large hit to use something like this.
You have to download. So the way what it's doing is it's literally running SQLite in the browser. So you have to download the entire binary to run SQLite via WASM. And I'm curious how large that actually is. Oh, so holy smokes.
410 KB.
Guess how big?
410 kilobytes.
Yeah, 558 kilobytes, but
Oh,
a 1.14 megs if you want the async version. I'm not sure what
interesting.
that means, but that's much smaller than I would have thought to be able to run SQLite in the browser via WebAssembly. I think there's also like going between the browser and WebAssembly, there's like a cost you pay for going across that bridge. But we had Johannes Schickling on, and he's one of the devs behind WebAssembly SQLite, and he knows the stuff. So I kind of trust him with this.
Yeah. There's also another one, PGLite, which is Postgres in WASM. And that's being created by the folks over at Electric SQL, which is one of these cool new local first platforms. And I think Drizzle even has support for PGLite now. Yeah. So, man.
That's what I want. I don't want to learn IndexedDB.
Oh, come on. Dexie's
I already know. Well, I can learn it, but you know what I mean? Like, I want to be able to just use the same database queries everywhere.
Totally.
And especially even if you're sharing schemas.
Yes.
Schemas?
Schemas. Drizzle does have, they even have a whole page, which we'll link to, which is Drizzle and PGLite, how you can use the two of them together, again, to do your Drizzle DB selects and all that stuff directly from PGLite, which, the big question I have with some of these still is that, because I haven't used any of these more intense ones, is migrations, and how do you handle that kind of stuff in a client-side level? I guess you're running the migrations on boot up or something? Yeah? I don't know.
Yeah, probably. I bet you try to keep them a little bit more flat. So I guess you don't have to, but yeah, that's a great question. You'd have to run it in the user's browser because that's where it exists.
Yes. So that's all great, right? You can store data in any of those numbers of ways, and primarily when you're doing this stuff, especially in applications that are loading this data, you can think of a lot of the times that this data, since it's living on the client, is a use case for not waiting for a long server response. Because if the data is living on the client, right, you don't necessarily always want to wait for the server to hit the database, to do all the database stuff on the server before returning HTML. You want to get the client-side HTML and JavaScript as fast as physically possible. Then the data's there. It doesn't take any time to read it from the local database. It's infinitesimally small to load from a local database compared to loading from a database on a server and building the HTML. So you're doing a lot more client-side rendering, which is one of the reasons why I've been talking about client-side rendering more. It's that you're sending the information to the client. The client is then grabbing the data, loading it up, getting you all ready to go. And then occasionally, if you need it, in the background, you could be fetching the data from the database. That database process on your server-side database could be kicked off right away. So that way, by the time that comes back, you initially have data, you initially have a loading thing that's beyond a blank skeleton screen, and then the rest of the data can be filtered in any sort of way. Now, you could have a little syncing message to let people know that data's coming in, or you could just pop it in, which might not be a great solution if you're getting your UI popping all over the place. Or you could have a button that says, there's new data, refresh, those types of things. But in reality, I think what it comes down to is that once you get into syncing data to a server, you're going to want to do it a couple of ways. Here's how I've done it specifically with storing things in Dexie. You store things in Dexie, and it's stored primarily in your client-side database. When you make a change, you push that change up to the server. When you load your application, again, you fire off a message that gets then pushed into your local database. That database updates the UI, and then that information is in your local database. You're just trying to keep those two in sync. At a basic level, for an application that one person is using, you're sending a message off on one device, whatever, that's very simple. We talked about how it can get really complex with conflict resolution. But the way these things will work, I believe, in the future, specifically a platform like ZeroSync does this really well. It stores your information locally, and it handles that sync process, and you're only ever writing one set of queries, or you're writing one set of mutations, all from the client side. and it just knows what to do. It's sending messages back and forth.
You're not being like, oh, you're not writing the glue code yourself to sync it and query from the right place, because that sounds like a really hard thing to do yourself.
Yes, and one of the cooler things that many of these new libraries are doing is that instead of like the naive way, I've done it the naive way a whole bunch of times. If you need the sync, by the way, there's plenty of application where you just save things locally and that's it. That's definitely super valid. So you don't always need a sync. The naive way is just to send all the information every single time, and that's too much information to send every single time. But if you're not dealing with a ton of data, not a huge deal. But the more and more data you add to the system, the larger and larger those sync messages are going to be. So a lot of the things that the new platforms are doing is via like patch messages. So it's only sending the data that's changed. So it's asking for what's changed since this version. Oh, this has changed. That way, that sync message becomes smaller not every single time, but it's smaller than it would be if you were sending all the data, meaning that trip becomes much less, meaning that you don't have that crazy pop-in or anything like that because it's not sending a massive bundle of data that then needs to get updated into your local database. So that is how you get it done with local data. Local data, I think, is widely underused, but I think it could be, greatly more used in terms of, like we mentioned, keeping persistent state for things like forms, surveys, things that would piss the user off if they lost their data in between save or refresh.
Can we rattle through a couple of the possible options for this? I know we did a whole show on it, but the author of TinyBase, when you were explaining it to me, I was like, I don't really understand where this is. And he said he explicitly added a diagram to the docs for us. And it's exactly what you were just explaining, right? Like it's local, but you can also synchronize, like it's a local database-ish. But then it will also synchronize, and it can also persist to like a Cloudflare or something like that.
Yes. And I believe James was on the Local First FM, Local First podcast, and gave a really great explanation about how TinyBase came to be. So that's well worth your time to listen to. But yeah, TinyBase is an option here. Replicache, I've talked about Replicache before. It is tough. Replicache is becoming zero sync, which in my opinion is way, way, way easier than Replicache. PowerSync, man, PowerSync is one of these ones that handles the syncing, but every single time I look at this platform, again, I there's too many graphs and diagrams to the point where I'm like, all right, what are you doing for me here? There's... Yeah, it's tough. RxDB is a cool one as an option for, again, the ones that make this the easiest are the ones that kind of combine the two. IndexedDB is a closed-sourced Firebase competitor that does local storage by default. That's pretty amazing. Electric SQL has kind of undergone some changes lately where they're kind of like, they're changing somewhat significantly. I know it was like become version 2 now, and I haven't checked in on it since they announced that it's going to change a little bit. But Electric SQL, like we mentioned earlier in this episode with the PGLite, has definitely been one of the bigger innovators in this space, along with the Replicache folks and many of these platforms. Honestly, TinyBase as well, for sure. There are a lot of these options. We've talked about it
Millions.
here. Yeah, I'm going to paste in localfirstweb.dev has a whole section on different software for these things. Yeah, I think there's a lot of different opportunity here. The most exciting one to me is Zero, because I've been, it's kind of the thing I've been like really hoping and wishing for.
Hacking with, yeah.
And I've been using it for a little bit. Granted, there could be other ones, like IndexedDB is a really cool option, but it isn't like, I can't spin up an IndexedDB server myself, and that's the only bummer about that, right? You're tapping into their ecosystem to get going. But when I wrote an app with IndexedDB, it was probably the closest thing I had to get 0 to 100 in this space, because it comes with like Auth and Magic Link Auth and all this stuff. Like you could have it up and running in no time. You're just not able to run it yourself at the moment.
Awesome. Well, that's local data. Hopefully you learned a thing or two. Let us know if you have anything to add. Tweet us, skeet us, email us, whatever you got. We're at Syntax FM.
Yes.
And that's it.
Yeah, and let us know what you're using local data for. If there's anything that we didn't mention in this episode that you think is a good use case for storing local data, leave a comment below, YouTube, Spotify, wherever you're at.
All right. Peace.
Peace.